Okay, so I'd like to talk about individualism today. I think it's particularly relevant because recently there have been many credible arguments being made against it in light of the American um, individualist response to coronavirus. I think it's a dually faceted issue in which the first part is that individualism is being conflated with a sort of irresponsible selfishness, which I think is a straw man that's being used to denigrate people who do things like say that they are not okay with being mandated by threat of government action and force to wear masks whenever they leave their homes or in other situations. And I think the second part of that issue, wherein a lot of people are denigrating individualism as a um, political philosophy and governmental framework, is that it has proven to be entirely unpragmatic in this situation. If your goal is oriented entirely around the value of the public health. So I'd like to talk about a few different parts of what I think is a good perspective on individualism during these times in which a lot of people's faith in it as a valid political philosophy may be shaky. So, first, I would like to remind everybody that we have rights as individuals. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean to have rights? Right? I think this word has become too broad in recent decades, especially in the West. And I would say much less so in the United States, but we're starting to catch up to our European and Canadian counterparts, wherein we are increasingly adding many positive rights in with negative rights. And there seems to be a group of people that have a preference for positive rights and not negative rights. In short, if you don't know the distinction between those two classes of rights, negative rights are rights that you have by virtue of existing as a human being that simply require that I do not interfere with you and your rights are maintained. So, for example, something like free speech. You have the right to say what you please. And that is a right that is maintained simply by me being passive toward you. I don't need to do anything to allow you to maintain that right. Now, I can infringe upon that right by doing something to silence you, like throwing you in a jail cell for expressing a political idea that I don't find acceptable. Or it could be I break into your house and shoot you, violating property rights and your right to life. So those are natural rights. Those are negative rights. You have them merely by existing, and nobody needs to do anything for you to allow those rights to continue to exist within you, for you to have them and enjoy them. Today, a lot of people on the left are denigrating negative rights and pushing for positive rights. Positive rights do require that other individuals do something for you. So, for example, saying that healthcare is a right, education is a right, affordable housing is a right, a living wage is a right, that basically everything you could ever want is a right. That feeling that even things such as emotional states you have a right to. You have a right to feel free of anxiety. You have a right to feel good about yourself. You have a right to even respect from other people. So this can be seen pretty clearly in the issues surrounding transgender rights activists. So they will say that, for example, I have to refer to someone by their preferred pronouns. This is not particularly unique to transgender rights people, but a lot of people in this sort of new left culture that have a whole array of different pronouns that they prefer to use, and they say that they have a right to have a certain feeling of self-identified dignity that can only be fully enjoyed by them if everybody around them is consistently involved in reaffirming their belief in their pronouns or something similar. So those obviously are very different in that they require other people to do things. And if you think that you have a right to something, that means that if someone does not provide you with that right, they're actually harming you. They are doing something against you. And when someone infringes upon your rights, the natural recourse is to retaliate, typically by use of force, right? And that can be seen in some of the more collectivist Western societies, such as in Europe. I think recently there was a I won't get into that, but there's plenty of examples of societies that are Western, are what I would call first world wealthy nations that have shifted increasingly in the past few decades away from individual sovereignty and respect for individualism toward a sort of collectivist approach. Okay, so what is the case for individualism? So I think that the reason that it's become such a problem in coronavirus is that we've seen that, yes, individual behaviors can affect the greater good of society, right? Both generally and specifically. So let's say your grandmother dies from coronavirus, and that affects you very much emotionally, personally, and you see people lollygagging in the streets, hanging out with their friends, refusing to wear masks. And obviously, there's a lot of emotional activity involved in that because you feel an immense frustration and anger toward people who are taking such cavalier attitudes toward something that you clearly now perceive as a very serious circumstance, wherein it's literally a matter of life and death, and they are sacrificing what is seen as a very simple gesture of collective risk avoidance, such as wearing a mask or not going out all the time every day, right? That could have saved your grandmother's life were a more universal approach adopted by Americans. And the thorn in the side of that thinking is individualism. Individualism obviously cannot mix with that way of thinking and that dream of a society where we all are constantly pushing toward what is seen by some people as very straightforward, very simple to understand, easy concepts. And this can be seen as the progressive understanding of this issue of coronavirus by a lot of, I think, social media posts. At least in my peer group, I've seen plenty of people post things like little cutesy graphics that have pastel colors on their Instagram stories and making passive aggressive tweets toward individualists and people who are even somewhat skeptical about these mass mandates to do things like wear masks or stay inside or other things. The phrasing, I think the political messaging is something like this: I stay inside, I wear masks, I socially distance because I care. I care. I'm an empathetic individual. I understand that I am not the center of the universe, and I don't want other people to die so that I can go grab a beer. And it's very difficult to argue with that, right? It's very difficult because basically in that framework you would have to say, well, my right to get a beer supersedes whatever amount of safety would be sacrificed on your end for me to be afforded that privilege, right? And so then we have to sort of confront this issue head on. I'd like to make what I think is the strongest case for why individualism and the respect of an individual's sovereignty has to be principle in any civil society that makes a claim toward morality and righteous governance. So we look toward the founding principles of this country. And I find that if we look through our nation's history, as scarred as it is with vast amounts of moral injustice on a huge scale, what we see actually is that the greatest amounts of injustice that has been put upon, in particular, minority groups and historically disenfranchised groups such as women, minorities, foreigners, native peoples, so on and so forth, it is not because of this ideology of individualism. It is because of a sort of perverse individualism, which is individualism in name only. So, for example, if I go trampling the rights of others, their natural rights, I enslave them, I oppress them, I don't allow them to speak, right? I don't allow them their say in our government. I'm actually not being an individualist. I'm being a collectivist who, by virtue of in our past likely being a landowning white male, is putting others down and preventing them from maximizing their liberty through individualism. Today, we have a much more egalitarian society in terms of the amount of individualism that has been spread throughout the groups that exist in our society. Women have individualism, men have individualism, blacks have individualism, whites have individualism, Native Americans have individualism, and if you come here and become a citizen, regardless of where you're from, you will enjoy the same rights under law and the same economic opportunities as these other individualists. That has not historically been the case. So why should we believe in individualism, right? Why should we? What's the argument? What's actually so good about it, other than Chad being able to go out with his bros from the frat to go grab a beer, even though it might kill grandma? And to answer that, I would say, well, Chad probably shouldn't do that, right? Or at least not do that very often. And if he should be cautious in how he does that. And the nature of individualism is that you can't pick and choose when it's convenient, right? Or when it feels good. So one of the largest arguments made against individualism consistently is that people will abuse their rights as sovereign individuals. Unfortunately, they will not always behave responsibly. They will not always have in their consideration of their behaviors how their choices will bear consequence onto others who are unwilling parties and are not given their say in that choice. But this is the case in nearly all circumstances, right? I mean, and to lesser degrees than is the case now, but nevertheless remains the case. So when I choose to drive my car to Wawa to go get some snack, just because I'm bored, I'm doing plenty of things that are arguably harmful for the public good and actually do fit into cohesive arguments that are being made today by the same people making arguments against individualism and for collectivism in light of coronavirus, but with much more vitriol and much more momentum and much more public support and strength, right? So let's take, for example, the driving to Wawa. I drive to Wawa, and what am I doing? First of all, I'm risking my life. Driving a car is dangerous. We know tens of thousands of people die or are seriously injured on the roads every year. So I'm putting myself in a position where I could seriously harm my family's well-being emotionally by doing something that's really not necessary, right? I don't have to go to Wawa to get a snack. Maybe getting this snack will make me slightly less healthy, and that will be worse for me, and it'll also be worse for other people around me by virtue of the expenses that I will put onto the healthcare system perhaps later in my life, right? And then let's also say, here's I think another one. I'm driving a car. What are cars known to do? They're known to pollute. So, and right now, by many of the same people that are prompting coronavirus as a very, very, very incredibly serious matter that needs to be dealt with on the utmost seriousness. I think most of those people would also agree that climate change is a very serious issue, if not a more serious issue than coronavirus, right? Coronavirus is going to kill what, like under 1% of people that it infects, as far as we're aware of. The death rate might actually be lower because of limited testing. We don't know yet, but it's very low. We know that. What about climate change? Well, the estimates for the death toll on climate change, if the most green eco warriors are to be believed, is going to be something close to the death of modern civilization as we know it, which will incur with it massive amounts of suffering and death. So even just marginal additions of unnecessary risk and societal ill that I incur for, arbitrary things that I just want to do. That essentially, I think, falls into the same class of behavior, perhaps with a less emotional sort of charge, because it's more abstract. But within the theory, it is more or less the same, right? I'm polluting unnecessarily for something that's just like for my own fun. It's not really important. It's not like I'll die if I don't get Wawa, and yet I do it. So the argument I'm trying to make is that there are some things that categorically have to be true universally. So either I have the right to behave as I will, even if it is not good for the greater society, and even if it won't be good for some individuals, even if I can't track the consequences with any accuracy. So maybe I pollute a little bit and I'm part of the reason that some African nation is submerged underwater or something like that, or has massive crop failure in 20 or 30 years, right? I played my part, a very small part, albeit, and the same goes for coronavirus. You don't know if the reason your grandmother got coronavirus was because of what I'm doing or what Chad did at the bar, but he is part of a greater trend of behavior that you don't like. And so there's a very strong and understandable urge to want to use government force to deter him from doing so, or make him do things in his behavior that would render him less harmful as a force in society. And so what's the cost, right? Because there's, what is the cost of such a thing? So on the one hand, you restrict people's ability to facilitate their own decision making, even if you don't agree with their decision making, like even a little bit, and you think that they're just absolute fools or heartless or unempathetic or psychopaths or whatever you want to call them, right? Let's just assume that you and them have to be observed the same legally. What is the preferred method? A collectivist method or an individualist method? Well, individualism, we're kind of seeing that play out now, and it's not particularly flattering in light of coronavirus. And so this cost, obviously any individualistic society that prioritizes individualism as the US uniquely does, is going to have certain situations that it's not able to handle properly while maintaining consistency with its core values. Okay, collectivism. Mandate masks, shut down a lot of unnecessary businesses, encourage people to stay indoors, or mandate that they only leave their house for bare necessities, and supply the American people with massive government subsidies for the foreseeable future. Okay, what is the cost? Well, first of all, the cost would be largely monetary, right? The economic cost is one that's been explained thoroughly enough, I think, by small business owners and Donald Trump alike. So I won't talk about that too much, but there are some games that you don't really get to play unless you play all the way. So once you start sacrificing individualism in instances where you feel threatened, those are actually kind of the instances in which you would like individualism to be the strongest. And in a way, and I feel sort of sick about this, it is almost nice seeing that people are able to get away with not wearing masks, with crowding themselves on beaches, and there's not some government boot that's coming down like the KGB or, the Stasi police to shut it all down. And that might sound dramatic, right? It might sound like you really think that protecting the public health is like communist Germany or something like that. And in degree, no, of course not. I think that I would still much prefer to be on a beach with a mask than to be in any sort of communist totalitarian state. However, it's really the principles that we're talking about. And this has a lot to do with the way you view collectivism. So can you temper a fundamentally collectivist viewpoint with a maintained respect across time for individualism? And I think the answer is pretty clear. You can't. I fail to find a society which has done this meaningfully well throughout history or today.